With the increased tension in Eastern Europe, Belgium have to be ready for any threat that may come to their doorstep. Besides that, there's also the refugee crisis that will not be resolved soon. So we asked the ambassador, what is going on in Belgium and Europe right now?
Yes, of course, it's they're confused times and they're dangerous times, and I think they're also an important moment in the history of Europe, having to think and rethink partly how it is going to defend itself and its interest over the next decades. This being said, NATO remain, of course, the basis, the very foundation of European defense. As you know, there have been changes in the United States. All European countries, and especially EU countries and NATO countries, are concerned with a number of signs that have been received on the way the new administration appreciates the European Union as an integration effort, and the way also the US sees its own role in NATO in the coming years and decades, knowing of course that the US has since the Second World War and since the creation of NATO a few years later been the heart of NATO, the strongest military in NATO, and of course the superpower that has been guaranteeing, preserving the interest and peace in Europe, which European countries have enormously appreciated since the 1940s and continue. For the next few weeks and few months, we do hope that the flaring up of attacks coming from rebel forces in eastern Ukraine are only going to be a temporary phenomenon, but we're concerned about it. We do think that the use of heavy weaponry in eastern Ukraine goes against the agreements in Minsk, and we do want the agreements to be respected, and we do hope that the peace will come back and that we will have a long-term solution being found between the different parties in the Ukraine, and the Ukraine not become a frozen conflict. For Brexit, which has, of course, security implications, but most of all economic implications and financial implications in Europe.
How much did Brexit have impacted the rest of Western Europe?
The effect is going to be very large. It's certainly going to be very large for Belgium, because the UK is a major partner economically and as far as investment is concerned. So it will be a large impact, but it will be an impact that definitely our economies in the EU and the Belgian economy are going to be facing successfully. The political impact, I'm coming back probably to my example of a few minutes ago. The European Union has never been as active and has never evolved as much as during crises. We have that impression suddenly that we're in 2016 and Europe has been going through since 1945 a very quiet period with no crises, with no tensions, with no conflicts. This is not true. We've been throughout the 1950s were frightening ages. The 1960s were full of crises in Europe, especially with between France and the UK about the European Union enlargement to the UK. Already in the 70s around NATO, which also explained why the NATO is now in Brussels. So, and I think Europe has been striving on those crises. I am definitely very concerned about the rise of populism, not only in the US, but also in parts of Asia, in Central and Eastern Europe, and in Western Europe. I don't think we should reduce the rise of populisms to only to the refugee crisis. I think we have been the at the receiving end of a perfect storm, in a way. First of all, economically. The crisis of 2008 is still more or less there. The Belgian economy has been doing pretty well, has been growing steadily, if not as fast as Indonesia over the past few years, and creating quite a lot of jobs. But it wasn't the case of all countries in and around Europe. Because we are coming also through a fourth industrial revolution. We are going through an industrial revolution where people are less needed, and where people, even if we create jobs, those jobs are changing. The manner people relate to their job, relate to society has been changed. Of course, part of that revolution is the social media that have not only changed the way we work and the way we see our jobs, but also the way we communicate and the way we can be sensitive to hate speech, maybe easier than we were before the explosion of the social media. And the refugee crisis, not on our eastern neighborhood, but in our southern and southeastern neighborhood, has been arriving at that very moment. So we have a social crisis, a structural crisis in our economies and in our societies that have found in the arrival of migrants and refugees a focus. Unfortunately, very often a very misguided focus, but that we have to accept it. So a perfect storm it was, having a large wave arriving at a moment where our economies were going through probably an earthquake. That's the magnitude of events that you can imagine. There was the economic earthquake, and then the immigration wave arriving at a certain moment. And probably arriving at the moment, which is also the case in most natural catastrophes, where the authorities, where the nations were not expecting it. And I think we didn't see the signs arriving, what we call the elites, the governments, the ruling classes, whatever the populists call it. But the people who are running the economy, running the government, running the academic circles, didn't probably see that anger, that resentment coming from uncertainty arriving. So all the appearances of an economic and social earthquake and tsunami. This being said, as far as we are concerned, the policy isn't going to change. Certainly, Belgium has been one of the founders of the League of Nations and the United Nations. We have been pushing very much to have the whole legal arsenal, the whole legal structure we developed within the United Nations, within the European Union, within the Council of Europe, to protect refugees, to protect human rights, to protect minorities.